Hey,
Hi, Kat.
hi John. So I'm Kat and this is John. We're both in the Developer Success Lab, and we decided to take a little bit of time to have a conversation and share it, which is something we have not ever done in the lab before, right?
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever done anything quite like this, actually.
And the reason is that we get a lot of questions as scientists in this field. We study software teams, and John and I have been engaged in a research project lately that is actually very topical to a bunch of stuff that we saw on social media. And normally we spend our time like taking many months to write a paper. But in this case, we had so many thoughts, we thought it might be fun to just have a conversation and share it with people. So I'm the VP of research at Pluralsight. I'm the director of the Developer Success Lab. I'm also a quantitative psychologist. I have a PhD in psychology. I've been studying how people learn, how people achieve, how software teams thrive for a long, long time. And I've had the pleasure of working with John for roughly the last year. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Right on. Wow. Yeah, that's always a hell of a set of credentials. Um, I am newly a principal research scientist in the Developer Success Lab with a stats and psychometrics focus, and I have really just been studying software developers for the duration of the time I've been at the lab. But previously, I studied adolescent um, neuroscience and personality psychology, and have a PhD in psychology. But I just became a methods head at some point along the way and started to care a lot about how we measure things. And that's one of the reasons I'm quite interested in the project that we're working on and this new research that's been shared around.
Yeah, awesome. Methods head. I've never heard that one. I've heard methods maven. I'm picturing like following a concert kind of thing, like the causal inference circuit that you're on, like
Absolutely. I mean, I am a fanboy to these very obscure statisticians. Um,
Hmm, okay,
so yeah, definitely on go, following the tour.
nice. So let's get some like deep cut takes, about causal inference, about I think one of the things that struck me coming into working with software teams as a psychologist is that psychology doesn't really talk to developers, right? I mean, we study all kinds of populations in psychology. I know that there are people who study technical teams and have contributed great work. But I think that there's like this larger conversation happening about how we measure human activity and how we measure human performance and how we think about collaborative work and complicated work. And sometimes I know you and I are sitting here kind of like, we've had this conversation before, but just not with software teams, right? Do you have that
Yeah,
feeling?
absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating to see and it, that this conversation is happening. It's very familiar. I feel like we can bring a lot to it, so it's super exciting. And then the thing that popped into my head when you're just mentioning this is that there are people who have been studying software developers and really worrying about some of these measurement issues. They just
Mhm.
it's like people forget. Like Margaret Ann's story is back
Right.
again, like commenting on this as well, and she has been quite vocal over the last, I don't know, how many years.
Yeah.
Um, so, but there's
People
still,
like
there's a lot
Marion
of,
Petrie as well, you
oh
know.
yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that has expanded our minds about what is it that it takes to build software and what are the human components of it. And yeah, you don't always see that stuff going viral on Twitter. So
indeed.
or yeah, or LinkedIn and the strange circles of like viral on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me kind of just provide a little context first, right? So what one of the things that we're talking about is we saw these claims get made on social media about what folks have been calling ghost engineers. Um, and we we were really struck by this, I think, because there were some claims like something like 9.5% of engineers are maybe not working at all, like a very shocking statistic. Um, and a very shocking statistic about people working remotely as well. It didn't match a lot of previous research I've seen about what happens when software engineers go remote. There was some really interesting work. I'll link this when we put up our video in the show notes, maybe. There was some interesting research that showed that like folks who went remote during COVID actually had basically very little productivity impact on development teams. Yeah, but John and I were looking at this, and I think we were both, it was so interesting. It was almost like the situation where you have your statistics open on your laptop, and then somebody's asking about the exact thing that you're studying. And we have just been through months of trying to make sure we don't make mistakes with this data, right? And trying to understand like the boundaries of our own uncertainty with this data. So I thought it might just be interesting to ask you, because you're someone who's brought so much of this method to our lab, you know, how do you think through some of these issues? And especially from the point of view of like, software developers who see this stuff float by on social media, they're not statisticians, they're not researchers. How can we all understand and sort of evaluate the evidence that floats by us? So maybe just a really high level question is like, what did you start thinking about when you saw these ghost engineer
Yeah.
claims?
Honestly, I mean, the first thought that popped into my mind is something that I've been trying to practice for a while since in psychology. We often have some very interesting, maybe counterintuitive claims that feel like big discoveries, but often these things they feel so big because they're big effect sizes, meaning just the
Mm,
effect that somebody is making a claim about is uh, is is claimed to be quite impactful, and this is definitely one of those cases. 10% of software
mm,
devs doing no work is wild. And so at first glance, you're like, oh, that's terrible. And then at second glance, you're like, can that possibly be true? So this is,
mm,
and not to say that I don't believe it, it's possible. There's a world in which that might be the case, but it's the kind of effect size that immediately strikes me as something to try to
yeah.
put into other terms to try to understand like what it looks like on the ground. Like, okay, if I'm on a team of 10 people, at least one of them is probably doing no work. But then also thinking about the variance around that estimate. So if you have this estimate of 10% of software engineers doing almost no work, that means some teams are fully productive and other teams have maybe half their members not doing any work, depending on the team size, something like that. Um, so putting it in that context, it started to make me think, is this something managers are really just not noticing? Like
Hmm.
what's the deeper, maybe even you might call it like a qualitative story here?
Hmm.
Um, if the numbers are true, what does that imply? Like, what else should we be looking for in the world that would kind of give us corroborating evidence that indeed this is a huge issue? So
Yeah.
that's where my mind went.
Yeah, me too. I went to research design questions first of all, of like, I imagined myself sitting at, doing writing R code and pulling up this number that said 9.5, people have zero commits in this data set, for instance. And I mean, my mind was like, oh, I failed to connect to a certain subset of repos. And
That's right.
they're not pulled in my mind went into extremely messy data cleaning. That's the world that I've lived in a lot of the time. You're speaking to a really great theoretical world that we also live in, which is like, what is happening with human behavior in order for this to be true? I love the point you made about variance because variance is like top of my mind with people's activity data over time. And depending on how you pull measures, right, and make an average from them, variance can like really trip you up. I mean, I'm thinking about things like someone doesn't code for a week because they're doing something else, and then the next week they do code. And if you only capture like them in that certain window, you're not getting what you can say is their average isn't really their average, right? So there's
Yeah,
a math question, there's a research design question, there's also like a what are the logistics of this question? We don't have the insight about that particular claim to know, but I thought it would be a fun jumping off point for some of these questions.
Yeah, for sure. I
Mm.
think that the point you made about data cleaning just by itself is super important. Maybe it's where my mind should have gone first. Yeah, it's, we
That's just
certainly,
you're bringing the academic sauce, and I'm bringing like having lived in so many trenches where I'm like, it was my code that was wrong, you know?
right. No, I mean, it has so many times been also my code that has been wrong, but yeah, those are the kinds of things that really make you want to be sure that your data is right. We saw in the project that we're working on, in the sense that the data that we're using, Cat, is cycle time data.
Yeah.
So we have people's open ticket times and we have their closed ticket times. But at some point, we stopped collecting the data and started analyzing the data. And some of those tickets that had been opened, say in December, um, uh, had not been closed, not because they were never closed, but because we had finished the period of time in which we were looking at the data. So like that's an instance where we came up against this thing that had we just left those as open tickets, or just set them to have been closed at the time that we stopped collecting data, we would have introduced some artifacts. I'm not sure what those would have looked like, but yeah, this data requires some deep thinking about just those really basic data engineering and data science questions.
Yeah, the word artifacts is like, I mean, I think whatever this little chat is between us, I'm gonna call it ghost data sets, I want to say, coming into my mind. Because you and I, right, we both have this attitude, we're constantly interrogating the measures that we have and asking, are they real? And I think being from psychology, you always think, I'm always creating a measure. I want to understand how people feel at work, but can I directly observe that? No. Like what I can do is create some operationalization, some signal, and that signal isn't the same thing as the thing. And there are other signals, many, many, many other signals in the same place. Yeah, that's a great example. I remember that calendar trick one, which caught us all out, and it was like, yeah. Another one I thought was about with our project was we see tremendous seasonality effects, right, from this kind of activity data. So just for people to know, if you see claims about developers and how they work, you don't have people who are thinking about cadences over a long enough period of time. It's very clear that some of these patterns do not have to do, I would say, with like the choices of the individual developer. It probably has to do with constraints of the organization or a pattern of the team, or like we're in a planning phase, right? Like it kind of baffles me that we treat these people like they are isolated individuals just chugging away, you know?
Yeah, frozen in time yet somehow still working. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, this blew my mind actually a little bit when I first came on the team because having not been part of this workplace before, I did not understand those time cycles, and they're very apparent in the data at the year level, at the quarter level.
Yeah.
We haven't looked really at lower levels of granularity in time, but I'm sure that you could find other kind of cyclic effects there.
Yeah.
Super
Yeah.
important.
This brings up something for me, which is like, the importance of all of the context of the data and sort of thinking, it's one thing to say I can talk about the people I've measured here in my study, but it's another thing to say I have accurately represented what's happening at this organization. And accurately representing what's happening in an organization has a lot of features that are not contained in your statistical model, right? Like you only observe what you observe. And for instance, if you're like, I'm thinking about selection bias, right? I'm thinking about in order to make a claim about a company and how a company's doing, you better have put some work into saying, I'm sampling across this company in a way that I think I'm gonna like achieve, the right sorts of data and the right sorts of, situations. I'm not just gonna ask like my five friends, right? Like this is sort of the basics of, the logic of some of our research here, but I think it's still useful to hear it.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of people, I know in psychology, we don't think about selection and sampling as much as we should. I'm not sure
Mm.
about software development, but it's certainly the case even thinking at the organization level and making a claim about the workforce in general. thinking about which organizations have you sampled?
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if we want to talk a little bit uh, to contextualize all this in a meta way about the research that we're talking about. A lot of
Sure.
things, there are a lot of unanswered questions. You mentioned ghost data before. We just
Mm,
don't have very much information about these fairly strong claims being made because there isn't a paper published. There's
yeah.
some slides from a conference and some Twitter posts.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and we can talk about maybe the ethics of that if you feel like it. That's another conversation.
Yeah.
I'm taking a line from Andrew Gellman, which is one of the statisticians I fanboy. Um, it's not that I disbelieve the claims. I just haven't seen what's the methodology that has been used to back up these claims. What's the sampling
Yeah.
procedure?
I'm
How
down to
can we be
talk about the
sure?
I'm down to
Yeah.
talk about the ethics because at
Mm.
the end of the day, it's not just us loving numbers and wanting numbers to love us back, which like I do like statistics. But it's not just an intellectual exercise. It is really important to think about our role as researchers in the world and the claims that we put out, and like we're human beings and human beings are imperfect, and so we know we can make mistakes in any research, but then you create checks and balances about the impact of your claims, and there's a time and a place to say, I have really good evidence that like policymakers need to hear, about something that's happening. But what one of the checks and balances on that is like transparency, is the data gets shared, the methods get shared. You can show that there's traceability. I think that would be an engineering, familiar term here. You
Indeed.
can go from the big claim back through the method and like understand the chains of inference and then understand also maybe, things that were left out. Um, yeah, and we take that very seriously. We take our role in that very seriously as a lab, right? And we think about things like we have an IRB that we set up. Um, I'm very uncomfortable with the leap to say we know what these, just because we haven't observed what people are doing with their time, we know what it is. That's a guess, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think there are big human ethical questions here, and that is interesting as an applied scientist, right? What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. It's something that I think goes along with making a big claim. It increases a little bit the necessity of being able to back up those claims with strong evidence and strong traceability to the methods. The thing that comes to mind with the work that we're doing is the way in which we are tentative in some of our claims because we have a set of data. We weren't able to design the sampling scheme for this data set. So we know that the organizations that we have access to are a specific subset of organizations. We think that they cover the industry fairly well. And we think that the data that come from those organizations is fairly robust in terms of including all of the users it should because individuals don't have to opt in to be part of this data set that we have. So we know we're getting data from a whole company if the company is in the data set, for example.
Hmm.
Um, but we also don't know as much as we might want to in an ideal universe about exactly how the company uses the code base and who these people are who are contributing to the code base.
Yeah.
We're measuring individuals, but some of those individuals, I'm looking at a graph right here that's, a person has cycle time data for a few months and then none for some months, and then they have cycle time data again.
Hmm.
If we really needed to dive into that, we would have to contact these companies
Hmm.
and get way into the weeds with these companies. I honestly don't know how hard it is, if it's at all as hard as getting into, say, a high school to, recruit adolescent participants to a research study. I
Right.
would
Yeah.
say
Which
it's
we've
it's
both done
really
that. We've
hard.
both worked with schools, and like that is a
That's right.
years long endeavor. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So on the one hand,
Wow.
we have to present the evidence that we have with some caveats saying this is kind of the best we know, but I think you and I personally don't want to make a claim that is going to feel at maybe at best insulting to people without having some
Yeah.
real strong evidence. Now, if it's true, of course, if this claim is true, I should say that the insult would be justly deserved, perhaps. But that's a moral question that I'm not going to get
Right. Yeah,
into.
I think you're holding like scientific neutrality on this
I'm really
claim
trying. Yeah,
really beautifully. I don't mind saying I don't believe it. Like I'm like the meme of the guy like change my mind. It just because we aren't going into these questions with no information about human beings.
that's
And,
right.
we live in the world and we can imagine things like the scenarios you imagine, it well informed. I try to tell developers, your lived experience of the world matters. Like my empirical data also matters. But it's like the coming together matters because scientists operationalize things and they only get parts of the picture. But then also, people with their lived experience have their own biases and their own perception, and they only get part of the picture. But, you are allowed to think about it when people are making claims about you as a group of people. And you can say, is it like this? Can I imagine edge cases? And I actually want to shout out the community I'm part of because I saw a lot of the folks who sent me messages actually asking, hey, Kat, would you say something about this? Had done beautiful reflective work. I saw it. It was almost like qualitative, experience sharing, like LinkedIn posts. They were saying, I'm a senior engineer. I know I contribute value. It looks like this on my team. They were actually opening up, right, to show us kind of what the data loss is. And they were saying, here's what's not captured, here's what's not measured. I find that like a beautiful activity, as much as sometimes it comes with snark and chaos and like, should we measure anything, fears from folks. I do encourage researchers to like listen to that because it's somebody telling you, like, I'm telling you there's a really important activity here. And then I'm already over here like, oh, cool. Like, how would I represent that in a study? How would I acknowledge that? And I think you and I in the project we're talking about, which, folks will see come out of our lab, hopefully, we're thinking about our story as being us talking and working through how do we measure the activity data, really? Like,
Right.
not how do we understand everything about individuals. That's not really our goal with this data set. It's very different research goal. That was
Yeah,
kind of
we've
rambly,
moved.
but
That's fantastic. I mean, you've primed a bunch of thoughts. I think the thing that's super interesting, um, that you were just talking about is, um, we see these things. We know in psychology and measurement, people who've taken courses on measurement, these are indicators that have multiple inputs potentially, but they're also just single. I mean, you might have multiple measurements of a single indicator over a period of time of a phenomenon. You kind of talked about this in the beginning of the chat too, but we we don't have direct access to this thing called productivity. Um,
Mhm.
the I think the
If
way
it's one thing for
if it's one thing, right?
maybe it's different for different people, right?
And in
As
different
well.
contexts, exactly. There's some deep philosophy work being done on the idea of like medium and low level theories that is really great for tackling those
Okay.
kinds of problems
Next chat.
in measurement.
Maybe we
Um,
need a philosophy series coming up for the lab. Yeah.
but the interesting thing about these data that have been recently popularized is that they're Git commits. They're measuring quality of Git commits, and that's an interesting indicator. And we have our cycle time, and that's an interesting indicator. We've talked about it as activity. We've moved away from the idea of framing it as productivity because at the end of the day, connecting either of those things, no matter how good your measurement of Git commit quality is at the end of the day, it's still something downstream from this phenomenon of productivity.
Yeah.
And it's not the only thing. Uh, and that seems to be one of the issues that has gone.
Yeah.
unrecognized, and this is what people are responding to on LinkedIn so beautifully.
Totally.
Um,
I think that's right. And people take a lot of measures at face value, right? Like
yeah,
they're just very intimidated by stuff that comes with numbers. And I mean, I've been that person. Like I'm not
me
like,
too.
yeah, like I think it's a cognitive bias we have, it's there's lots of reasons for it. It may sometimes feel like the only way you win an argument inside of a business or something. There's a lot of reasons, but the fact is we are constructing these measures. And, you know, I do try to remind people in our audience sometimes, hey, if you feel upset, if you feel like you're being mismeasured, that is a very valuable feeling. And it's probably there because you're quite aware that something about you is being lost. And, I think it can be really
Yeah.
interesting to ask, where are we okay with that? Like, where and why are we okay with it? Like, I really like tracking my fitness, even though I think there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get tracked that also matters to me, like my self-confidence or my belief that I can like climb a rock face without falling down, or those actually could be measured on like a psychological survey, but even those would be like imperfect, proxy measures. But you could track it once in a while if you wanted to. But then if my like, I don't know, if a gym made it a requirement that I report all of my psychological feelings to the gym, in order to be a member there, I would ask, what are you doing?
Indeed.
So things can be real and they can be measurable and they can be like worth studying, but it also like who does the measuring matters to us, it changes the meaning of it.
Yeah, I think the point about not necessarily you don't have to believe the numbers. They come from somewhere.
Yeah.
There's again a point of balance here. You can always learn a lot of the time you can learn from these numbers. But you don't have to believe them either as you're saying, um,
Mm,
as a consumer of research, but also as a researcher, going
mm,
back to what we were talking about, we have theory, we have at the very least our folk theories about human cognition.
mhm.
Um, but uh, sorry, one second. Um, we have at the end of the day, what we can always fall back on our folk theories. But being involved as researchers in this area, we have a ton of information out there. Um, and as researchers, we don't have to let the numbers play God with our inferences, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. Yeah, I love that.
It's a
I
shame that this might these kind of events lead people to into a fear of being measured, and that's a hard place for us to find ourselves as researchers interacting with these populations who we really want to get that measurement right, and we understand why people are afraid of it. Um, but it's hard for us to change that culture without doing work measuring folks who are then afraid of the measurement. So that's a thing I think I'm learning a lot about in this lab right now.
Yeah. I think it's we have a duty of care. I like to describe it like
Mm,
we have a responsibility. You and I are people who have whatever we have. We have PhDs, there's like reasons people listen to us when we say we did some math, right?
yeah,
I think some of those reasons are earned and some of those
yeah,
reasons are just not earned, And it's
yeah,
just, and I think trying to be a person who's mindful of that, just like I ask our engineering colleagues to be mindful of the fact that they get credibility in technical spaces that sometimes it can be hard to get when you're a social scientist. And I ask them to share that, with me and call me technical.
right.
Um, and likewise, I want to invite them in, to our research and to say, perhaps we will get some things wrong sometimes, but my hope is that you will know that. You will be
Yeah,
able to find that out, and we will be engaged in like the self-correcting process of science together. Um, that's my hope. Yeah.
yeah. That's wonderful. That's why I like working on your team.
That sounds like a perfect place to end this
It kind of
chat.
feels it kind of feels
Wow.
good. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh,
Hopefully this is helpful for folks wading
I
through
hope so.
this stuff.
Let us
And if
know.
yeah, I would love to hear from folks. We love people's lived experience, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, thank you.